This was a realization that I had in my hands and my authority, the power to destroy the earth or to wipe out 100 million people. I think it's a mistake for the Western world to relax. We've got to let the Soviets know that we are prepared to defend ourselves.
How do you assess the damage to Israel's moral position of the events in Lebanon?
I think there is severe damage. Israel is indeed becoming more and more isolated in the world community, which in the long run is not going to be good for them at all. The holding of our hostages, when our nation was looked upon as weak or impotent, not able to extract 52 people from a lesser nation like Iran. On numerous occasions, I would pray that God would bless Khomeini and would give him sound judgment.
Do you see any dangers to the American system if the better actor, if you like, goes on winning elections?
Well, I don't think this is an inevitable thing. When we do make a political mistake, I think there'll be a reaction against it. Go to 6 cities.
The Main Street storefronts still bear their patriotic banner, but are now largely empty and deserted. The president's infamous brother Billy once owned the gas station on the Main Street. It was and is the only place to get a beer in town. Nowadays, few come for beer, even fewer come for gas. The train station, once a throbbing campaign headquarters, is now a makeshift museum. The memorabilia and the train tracks sleep quietly in the warm Georgia sun. The Baptist church, pretty in its white southern paint, is no longer staked out by the carrion television crews, eager for a glimpse of the peanut farmer pursuing his Christianity. In better days, the highly painted water tower was the platform from which those television networks sent their pictures to the world. But now the attention has passed, the streets are empty. The only movement is in the peanut warehouse and in the fields, and the once busy tourmobile, which carried eager, snapping tourists, lies silent and broken. Carter himself is far from broken. He jogs daily, on this occasion with son Chip and a Secret Service detail. And although defeat by Reagan and the Californians in November 1980 gave back to Carter a private family life, he still is forced to live behind an iron fence brought by the Secret Service from Nixon's Key Biscayne compound. The day we spent with him, Jimmy Carter looked relaxed and presidential. He talked about those days, late in 1976, when, with the election in the bag, he was preparing himself for the White House.
A few days before inauguration, I began to meet, a few weeks really, I began to meet with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the new Secretary of Defense, and brought in the Vice President really for the first time to make sure that I understood the procedures to be followed if a nuclear war should erupt, if we should discover that the Soviets had launched an attack upon us, for instance, with intercontinental missiles. And this was a realization that I had in my hands and my authority, the power to destroy the earth or to wipe out 100 million people in retaliation or to save my own nation's existence. This obviously was a sobering factor and a great inducement to search for nuclear arms control, reduction in arsenals, and to make sure we had peace, not only with the other nations who might be adversaries of others, but to try to dampen down trouble spots in the world like in the Mideast. Another thing, of course, was that I began to realize much more clearly that in foreign policy, a president has a great authority, a great power, a great influence, not only with his voice, but with his own decisions, just as the way our Constitution is written. But on domestic affairs, economic questions, the president is just one voice among many. And in the private business sector, on Wall Street, and the Federal Reserve Bank, and the Congress, many other places, there are factors of equal importance along with the president's. So that realization that in foreign policy I could help to shape the major purposes of our country was a realization that was gratifying.
You wrote in the book, every serious candidate for this office must decide whether he is capable of using or is willing to use nuclear weapons. Is that a decision that you consciously made at some point? You sat down and said, I can do this.
My background is in the military. I was in the Navy for 11 years. I was a submarine officer, worked under Admiral Rickover in the development of the first atomic submarines. And I recognize that the best way to avoid war, to maintain peace, is to have military strength that's adequate to defend ourselves. And that the nuclear deterrent is a sure way to let the Soviet Union know that if their adventurism does extend to an attack on my country or to an invasion of Europe, that it might very well be suicidal for them. That realization on the part of the Soviet Union or any potential adversary is very crucial in order to preserve peace.
How would you assess the global ambitions of the Soviet Union?
Well, let me just cover briefly recent history, beginning with the emergence of the phrase detente. The Soviets had an opportunity then to demonstrate to the world their peaceful intentions. Instead, for some reason, which only they would understand, they have built up their military capability enormously. They have at least 3 times as many tanks and other military forces within the Warsaw Pact as could conceivably be necessary to defend themselves against an attack from Western Europe. The only logical conclusion is that they have ambitions of an offensive nature. I wrote very carefully the chapter about my meeting with Brezhnev and the nuclear arms negotiations. And I described his statements that he made across the table and also privately with me in Vienna, without distortion and without editorial comment, because I wanted the reader, at least one place in a book or an article, to have the American point of view, the Soviet point of view juxtaposed about the same troubled spots in the world and the same issues, to show the difference in attitude and let them draw their conclusions. So I think we've got to be cautious about the Soviet Union. I think they'll probe when they can to find a place to expand their own influence. I think they will avoid, at least for the foreseeable future, any possibility of a war actually coming to the Soviet citizens themselves. And this is obviously a very major stabilizing factor, but I think it's a mistake for the Western world to relax. We've got to let the Soviets know that we are prepared to defend ourselves, that we will not become militarily inferior at any time or in any way, and that we will respond aggressively if we are attacked.
Could God ever wish that button to be pressed?
I think not. No, I don't think that this would be the will of God to press a button and to kill tens of millions of people. And I've had to think about that question as a religious person. But as I said before, the existence of that power, that potential destruction, has to be maintained to balance the threat of others who have the equivalent power, and the realization that any preemptive attack or initial attack by nuclear weapons would be suicidal, I think has kept the world at peace since the Second World War. At least it's avoided superpower confrontation, and of course it is a factor for peace. At the same time, knowing that I led one of the greatest nations on earth, maybe the strongest, militarily, politically, economically, I thought it was important for us to let the world know in no uncertain terms, and never with a deviation, that we were in the forefront of the kinds of ideals that are important to human beings throughout the earth. First of all, that we were in the forefront of seeking peace, not just for ourselves against potential adversaries of the United States, but in other troubled areas. I devoted a lot of time to the Mideast because I thought it was a focal point for perhaps a wider conflagration. The second thing is, I thought it was important for our country to be seen clearly as in the forefront of a search for nuclear disarmament. The limits on future development of nuclear weapons, a rapid reduction in nuclear arsenals leading ultimately to the elimination of nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. Third, I thought it was important for our country to be in the forefront of freedom and democracy, the enhancement of human rights, not to intrude unnecessarily in the affairs of others, but just say this is one nation that will hold high the banner freedom, human rights.
Now, you're known as a good and religious man, but a president like that, mightn't actually the world be a bit less stable if the enemies of your country attempt to try it on, to test you, see you as a soft touch?
I think it's too fanciful. I don't see any evidence of it. As you know, the one event that occurred during my presidency, when the Soviets indeed were an aggressor nation, the invasion of Afghanistan, I think the general analysis by historians would be that our country moved most vigorously, more forcefully than all of our other allies. We tried to lead the world in two responses, one political in nature, with condemnation within the United Nations, an unprecedented thing for a major country like the Soviet Union, when 125 or so countries condemned them for their invasion of Afghanistan. Secondly, our refusal to go to the Olympics, which was a very painful thing for us and for the other 55 countries who decided the same. But it was a severe political blow to the Soviet Union. The economic boycott, we analyzed all the factors involved, what could possibly be done to let the Soviets know that they had made a serious mistake. The only thing we could see that would be at all damaging to the Soviet Union was a grain embargo. And so I think that one evidence of a strong and forceful response on our part would negate any possibility that the Soviets looked upon us now or then as a so-called soft touch.
Has there been a deterioration in relationships with the Soviet Union since President Reagan took office?
Yes, I think so. Although I hesitated because the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan is a main precipitating factor in the Soviets' disrepute among the other nations of the world, and it certainly drove a wedge between us and the Soviets when we were trying to be more cooperative. But the belligerent statements that have been forthcoming from the White House, the careless statements concerning the possible feasibility of a limited nuclear war that would be fought in the European theater, these kind of things have created not only consternation in Europe and our country, but also, I'm sure, created deep concern in the Soviet Union.
Can we turn to the Middle East now? And I want to ask you if the spirit of Camp David is dead.
Well, the spirit of Camp David may not be dead, but it's sick. The letter of Camp David, I believe, is still the only basis that I can see for future progress. It's a brief document. It's written not in lawyers' terms, but in peanut farmers' terms. I wrote a lot of it. It's easily understood. It spells out a formula for Israeli existence and security. It reconfirms Israel's commitment to the principles of United Nations Resolution 242, that is, withdrawal from the occupied territories in exchange for peace, in effect. It calls for full autonomy for the Palestinians, or the inhabitants of the West Bank and Gaza. It calls for the Palestinians to join the Jordanians, Egyptians, and Israelis and the United States in negotiating the terms for final status of the West Bank and Gaza. And then it also provides, which some people forget, a referendum to be held among the Palestinians themselves to either accept or reject the final proposal for the final status of the West Bank and Gaza. So it's got within it all of the elements that are needed for a permanent peace in the Middle East. But at this time, the actions of Israel, on the one hand, and the refusal of the Arabs to join the talks, are holding in abeyance the promise of peace.
How do you assess the damage to Israel's moral position of the events in Lebanon?
I think there is severe damage. One of the reminders that I constantly put forward to the Israeli leaders was that it's not good for them to be isolated in the world. And I think they have been quite callous under Begin in taking actions that arouse the condemnation of many nations, or at least the alienation of many of their former friends. The massacre at Beirut was a horrible event. The actual invasion of Lebanon, in my judgment, was a gross overreaction to the PLO aggravations. And I think Israel is indeed becoming more and more isolated in the world community, which in the long run is not going to be good for them at all.
Now let's talk for a while about the office of president. In those first moments in the White House, you say you savoured the solitude. Tell us more about the loneliness of being president.
The White House is a big place. It has 7,000 or 8,000 tourists every day who come through the place just as an attraction, as a point of interest in part of our nation's history. But we treated it as a home. We opened up all the doors, unlocked the avenues through the hidden passages. Spent a lot of time outside throwing frisbees on the lawn, and Amy rode her tricycle and skated on the pathways. I ran a lot and swam and played tennis. We just used it as a real home. Had a lot of visitors there. But every now and then, I would wander around the White House and look at the mementos that had been left by presidents, the little writing desk that Thomas Jefferson himself made, the room where President Roosevelt in his wheelchair would go up under a high table to examine the maps that he and Winston Churchill perused during the Second World War. And I learned from them, from Harry Truman and others, that the decisions that come to a president who doesn't have a major political party behind him, like in the parliamentary system, are the ones that can't be resolved in a private home or a county courthouse or a city hall or a state legislature or a governor's office or even in a branch of the federal government. They're the ones that are the most difficult, the most controversial, the most far-reaching, the most important. And they're also quite often the decisions where your advisors are almost equally divided, 50% on one side, 50% on the other side. So the solitude of the presidency is very remarkable to me. Harry Truman's sign I kept on my desk, "The buck stops here," was not needed as a reminder, but it exemplifies what I'm trying to say. It wasn't an unpleasant thing for me to make those final judgments in a lonely fashion. I felt capable of doing it. I was calm and had a lot of confidence in myself.
Did solitude clear your head?
Yes, it did. I'm an early riser. Quite often I would be up at 5 o'clock in the morning, go over to the Oval Office, read the morning papers, peruse the reports of the CIA, which came in daily, the daily reports of the Secretary of State. And then as day began to break, after all that reading, sometimes I would walk by myself in the gardens of the south lawn of the White House and just think about the issues that I had to face during the day. I liked the solitude. At Camp David, which is my favorite place, I think I probably know the woodlands there and the little paths through the forest better even than the keepers who maintain Camp David on a full-time basis. I've always been a farmer, an out-of-doorsman. I like the swamps and the fields and the streams, and I tried to savor as much of that as I could at the White House. And during those lonely, early morning times in particular, my thoughts were clearer, and if I had a judgment to make, I think I made a sure judgment.
Why have so many presidents, all perhaps since Roosevelt, complained about the frustrations of the office, and each one failed to carry out a substantial part of his agenda?
I commented on this earlier because it takes a while to realize how limited is a president's power in dealing with domestic issues. The president can prepare a budget. The Congress can modify it. As a matter of fact, this year, for the first time in history, President Reagan submitted his budget to the Congress, and it was never considered. There was never even a subcommittee hearing to consider the President Reagan's budget. I never had that experience, and I'm thankful for that. But the Congress can modify the budget. Taxation has to be initiated within the Congress. The President can make proposals, but as you know, the tax bills are passed by the Congress. The President's obviously got some influence there in the progress of the bills through the Congress. He can veto a bill if it's obnoxious to him, but that's a fairly rare thing. Last year, as you know, President Reagan was successful in getting an enormous tax reduction through the Congress, which has precipitated economic ills for the whole country. This year, the Congress pursued, and he had to sign the largest tax increase in our country's history. So I think most people, when they are first elected, don't see, as an incumbent president, those severe limitations on his domestic authority. We don't have the ability, as you have in Great Britain, that if the Parliament or Congress fails to carry out a major commitment of the President, that a new election can be held. There's not that, and there's very little discipline, particularly within the Democratic Party. Party discipline is practically non-existent.
You have some very harsh words about the lobbies. You say the lobbies are a growing menace to our system of government. What do you dislike most about them? What are you getting at?
Their ability to use money to influence the vote of members of the Congress. This can be done under our system legally. Cost of elections are going up rapidly, and a lobbyist can, year after year after year, give an incumbent member of the House or Senate $1,000 a year or $5,000 a year. If he happens to be a committee chairman, $25,000 a year. Sometimes that member of Congress won't even have any opposition. He won't have to expend money to be reelected. There are no tight constraints on how that money should be spent.
So it's a bribe?
It's a legal bribe, yes. And members of Congress, quite often those who serve for 3 or 4 years and then retire, will go to the floor of the House and say, one of the reasons that I have quit the Congress is because I can't stand to live in this environment of the so-called, as you say, legal bribes. There's also a growing system of legitimate threats where the special interest groups who are very affluent can go into a district and without it being charged against the limits on campaign expenditures, castigate the incumbent Congress, reflecting on his own character. And
a group like the moral majority?
Like the moral majority, yes. And this can be done with impunity as part of our system. A good many organizations like Common Cause are trying to correct this defect in our system, which is growing. It's not attenuating, it's getting worse every year. So far, nothing's been done about it. I wanted to add my voice to it as an experienced politician. And my prediction is that only after we have a terrible scandal in our nation will there be an uprising among the people adequately strong to convince the Congress to correct this defect.
But at the moment we've got lots of little scandals all the time,
yeah,
which nobody worries about.
Absolutely.
Now you put your finger on the weapons manufacturers as a particularly insidious lobby. Tell us about them.
They're very powerful. Not only because the Congress listens carefully to the military leaders, not just those who are still serving, but in particular the very hawkish, retired admirals and generals who have no responsibility, who wouldn't have their own lives endangered if we had at least a conventional war, but who are always persistent in their testimony that we should build up the military complex enormously above and beyond any realm of rationality. Also, quite often they are hired by the manufacturing companies who make weapons, and they have the ability to spread the system of supply and manufacture throughout the country so that they can say this will create jobs in an area of high unemployment. I tried to hold down the arms trade, the selling of weapons all over the world to people who are not our allies, and we were reasonably successful. This was contrary to the interest of the so-called military-industrial complex. This past year, I noticed under President Reagan, the sale of American military weapons to other countries doubled. I think it was in the neighborhood of $25 billion, an unprecedented figure. The weapon systems that are obsolescent, quite often an absolute waste of money, can be approved if a president is quiescent, and the Congress can be touched by these lobbyists. They might say, okay, I need the A-10 or airplane, which is an obsolescent plane, to be built in my district because it provides several thousand jobs. I'll vote for your weapon system where you have a Navy yard if you vote for my A-10, and you can put together little interrelations among the members of Congress that will support this. So this is one example of the kind of detrimental factor in our Congress.
Are the weapons manufacturers then an engine keeping the arms race going?
There's no question about that. And as I mentioned in the book in one place, I really poured my heart into this book. One one of the things that aggravated me when I was president among my own military leaders, they're independent of the president to some degree, but although I'm the commander-in-chief, they have a degree of independence, was their false claims that we were weak and the Soviets were strong. This is a very serious misstatement of the fact. We're not inferior to the Soviet Union. If you have a balanced assessment, we're just as strong or stronger in almost every element of military strength as are the Soviets. But in order to get a higher budget allocation, there's always an inclination on the part of military leaders to say, we need this, we are out of money, we're getting inferior to the Soviet Union, we've got to have more missiles, more ships, more airplanes, more tanks, more new electronics controlled anti-tank weapons and so forth. And it does work with the Congress in getting higher allocation of funds, but at the same time it creates a misapprehension among our own people. We are fearful that we've become inferior. Our allies doubt our resolve or our basic strength, and most seriously, the Soviet Union or other potential adversaries might very well be misled and initiate a suicidal attack on our country.
Now, you wrote in the book, knowing how confused and fragmented the system is, how intense the forces are that tend to induce ill-advised decisions, and how fallible the leaders who serve in public office, it is almost a miracle how well our nation survives and prospers. Mightn't that be saying that the Founding Fathers actually got the system right?
There are a few things wrong with the system, but they're not catastrophic or fatal. The division of powers is one with which I agree completely. The Congress, the Supreme Court, the system of courts, and the presidency and the administrative branch. There are a couple of things that I would like to see changed, and most observers would agree with me. First of all, the president should have one 6-year term and not have to offer himself for re-election. I won't go into all the ramifications of that, but it's a general consensus among scholars, and I think all the former presidents would agree that this should be done. The second thing, and I think much more damaging to our country, is a requirement that when a treaty is signed, like the SALT II Treaty, or the SALT I Treaty, or the Limited Test Ban Treaty, or the Treaty Against Genocide, or in favor of human rights, it has to receive a 2/3 positive vote of the U.S. Senate. The Constitution should have said that the presumption is that the treaty will be honored unless 2/3 of the Senate disagree with the president. It's almost impossible to get 2/3 of the Senate to support anything that's controversial in nature. We negotiated a very good fisheries agreement with Canada, for instance. A majority of the Senate was strongly in favor of it. But a few politically oriented U.S. senators from the Northeast had some criticism from their fishermen, and we were never able to get the treaty ratified. And many of the major treaties, all those that I named to you, are being observed, but have never been ratified or not now ratified by the Senate. That's a fatal, not a fatal, but a very serious defect in the U.S. Constitution.
President Carter, why did you call your book Keeping Faith?
It has multiple meaning. It has some religious connotation, but that's not the main thrust of it. When I was campaigning for the presidency, we were in the throes of disillusionment in our country with the Watergate revelations, the misleading statements that had come out of the White House, the pangs of defeat in Vietnam, the revelations that our CIA had been ordered to perform illegal acts, and so forth. So the people in our country were quite disillusioned about the government. And my main message to them, which prevailed over all the other candidates, even though I was unknown at first, was to keep faith in our basic principles, our basic thrusts and ideals. That's one element of it. Another one was that I wanted to emphasize, without saying so too much in the book, that I try to keep faith with the commitments and expressions of intention that I imparted to the American people during the campaign. And third, when we did face difficulties or need to recognize really for the first time that our nation has limits with the oil shortages, the worldwide inflation that swept because of the Iranian Revolution, the seizure of our hostages, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that we needed to keep faith in one another, not be disillusioned enough to despair, and recognize that our nation was still strong, vigorous, capable, and that the future was not dismal but bright.
I want to come back to that question of limits because I think it's a theme that runs right through the book. But in the religious sense, what has being president done to your faith?
If it changed, it strengthened it. I was a mysterious figure politically when I arrived in Washington. I had been elected from out of nowhere. I was not endorsed or supported by the major lobbying groups and major law firms in Washington, the major Democratic political figures. I had never even met a Democratic president, and still haven't, by the way. I was not a part of the high society establishment or the Wall Street business establishment. And so I was kind of an unknown factor there. And so when I did get to Washington, I had to carve out for myself a position that was compatible with my own background as a kind of an ordinary farmer.
You wrote in the book again, Rosalind and I had a kind of blind faith that we would be successful in overcoming great political odds. Did your faith blind you to the limits of what was politically possible?
No, I don't think so. I never assumed that I was God's chosen man, ordained from heaven to be President of the United States or reelected as president when I was in office. I never prayed that God would let me be reelected and so forth. That was contrary to my religious faith to do something like that. But I did have a sense that I was doing what was right, that I was doing my best, that the actions that I took, the principles that I espoused were the proper ones. I saw the damaging effect, obviously, of the worldwide inflationary pressures and high interest rates on the economy of our country and on my political well-being. I saw the damaging effects, obviously, of the holding of our hostages when our nation was looked upon as weak or impotent, not able to extract 52 people from a lesser nation like Iran. And I was the epitome of that as a president of my country. During the height of the Iranian debacle, when our hostages were being taken, I tried to convince myself to be benevolent in my attitude toward Khomeini, which was the most difficult thing I guess I tried to do.
Did you fail to be benevolent?
Well, only on numerous occasions I would pray for that God would bless Khomeini and would give him sound judgment and so forth, and I tried not to condemn him. But I can't say that I'm perfect because I had feelings of disappointment and animosity and hatred in me, but I tried to wipe them out.
Did the Country Hicks cartoons hurt?
Yes, somewhat. But we were so flushed and exhilarated by the final victory of being elected that we looked on those Country Hick type cartoons more with amusement and laughter than we did with pain. It was just a transient thing, the rash of cartoons. But I think that our efforts did succeed in some areas. I eventually had a good relationship with the Congress, in my judgment. It wasn't perfect, but it was adequate. The main failure I had, I think, was with the press. I never was able to have an easy working relationship with the news media. Although one of the brightest spots in my presidency were those frequent times when I had presidential news conferences. I looked on it as a good opportunity to present my views to the television viewers and radio listeners in an undistorted fashion. And secondly, it was a stimulating opportunity for me to be challenged by the press and also to defend my policies. I really enjoyed that. But I never did have any news columnists who habitually took my position and were defending my policies. I don't say that in a deploring way. I think every now and then I would soberly look upon history and try to place myself among other presidents. And compared to the way the press in our country treated Nixon or Johnson or Truman or further back Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson even, they treated me very well. Even Gerald Ford, who was in office only a short time, who was probably the best athlete who's ever been in the White House, was looked upon as someone who couldn't walk straight and who couldn't go through a door without bumping his head. And although he stood in the top one-third of his law school class, he was looked upon by the press and characterized as someone who wasn't very smart. Well, even Gerald Ford, I think, suffered by the press, from the press more than I did. So this adversarial relationship between the press and the president is inevitable and good. I admit that. But at the time, I deplored the fact that I couldn't relate to them more effectively.
Now, you dismantled some of the trappings of the presidency. With hindsight, would you say that was a mistake? Don't the American people want a royal family to look up to?
They do. I thought in some previous administrations we had gone to excess. And I really represented in the White House what was my nature, my own lifestyle. My people have lived in this country 350 years. We've all been farmers, every generation. My father or no one before him had ever finished high school. No one had ever had a chance to go to college. I came out of Plains, Georgia. And it was not my style or my character to be like a king or an emperor or a member of a royal family. I wasn't putting on airs when I took on or continued the role of just a common man. But you're absolutely right in saying that many people in our country looked upon this as a sign of excessive rejection of the prestige and authority of the presidency.
One reviewer says you suffered from an inability to dramatize and project yourself and your goals. Do you accept there's an element of truth in that?
I think so. I'm obviously not a professional actor. I think President Reagan showed during the campaign of 1980, and since he's been in office, that he's a very able communicator. He's done this all his adult life, and he knows how to do it. My background and training is in engineering and science, and I think I'm overly inclined to try to present both sides of an issue and then to draw a conclusion. Sometimes I found that by the time I got through describing both sides of an issue, I had lost my audience and they didn't hear my conclusion.
Do you see any dangers to the American system if the better communicator, the better actor, if you like, goes on winning elections?
Well, I don't think this is an inevitable thing. When we do make a political mistake, I think we did as a nation in 1980, as a strictly unbiased analyst, in choosing President Reagan, who had simple answers to all the difficult questions and simple solutions to all the very complicated issues. I think there'll be a reaction against it. I also thought that the so-called Reaganomics was a matter for ridicule. It was ridiculous, in my opinion. But in his ability to communicate the opportunity for a very simple, painless answer to the world's economic woes, he was successful, above and beyond what I thought.
Do you see? You condemned his simplistics. Do you see continuing dangers in them?
Yes, I do. I've seen, as I'm sure the people of Great Britain have, some of the analyses of the instigation of Reaganomics, where almost every one of his advisors said, "Mr. President, this won't work." But still he went forward with a plan. And there is no way that you can have a $750 billion tax reduction in 5 years, enormous and unprecedented and unnecessary buildup in the military strength of our country, great expense, and to balance a budget. We've proven all those things to be fallacious. Our country has more unemployed people today than we've ever had in history, even including the Great Depression. Our farm income is at the lowest point in 50 years. Bankruptcies are higher each week than have been in 50 years. Our budget deficits are unprecedented. They are 3 times as great as we've ever had before, even in the last year when President Ford was in office. So the consequences of the so-called Reaganomics have not adequately been recognized or felt in our country. I think the future, immediate future, of the American economic system is very dismal.
What's going to be your future role? Have you definitely ruled out running for president again?
Yes, I don't have any ambition or plan or intention to run for public office again. I've held the highest elective office in my nation, perhaps the highest elective office in the world. I have a lot of other things that I've ahead of me that I think might be equally as important, possibly as being president.
Like?
Well, I'll do several things. I'll be very brief. I'll be teaching at Emory University, a small, highly qualified university near Atlanta. I'll be building a presidential library. Associated with it, I'll try to teach 1.5 million visitors a year the history of our country from the unique perspective of the 39 presidents who've served our terms in office. Then I hope to establish a center for the resolution of crises or disputes, something that I felt was needed when I was president. We don't have such a place anywhere in the world. We thought the United Nations would be that kind of place, or maybe the Organization of American States. It haven't turned out that way. If two Central American nations, for instance, have a border dispute, the last place they'd want to go would be to New York, where they might lose face by even trying to resolve their differences. If they failed, it would be embarrassing, and to get 150 other nations involved in that dispute would be counterproductive. Well, I hope to have a center where those two nations, for instance, could come and say, help us choose a trusted mediator. Let us work on our problem for a few days or a few weeks in seclusion and without any publicity or fanfare. The chances are they would not succeed completely, but they wouldn't be embarrassed by failure, and they might open up avenues of future communication. If they succeeded, they might avoid a confrontation. So I think those kinds of things where I would use the full prestige and influence of, as a former president, to bring together people who were important, to assess issues of significance, and then to make sure that the recommendations were not ignored and to resolve disputes would be good. And I can use perhaps the remaining years of my life as one of the former presidents in history who was the younger, or a challenge that I relish. The publishers in our country, Bantam, publisher, and so I offered to go to 6 cities to do some media work.